I'm going to be talking about I am the resurrection and the life, but I'm well aware that that's a bit of a weird word. It's quite long, and some of you probably don't even know what resurrection means, and we've been singing about it. And so can anyone here define what the resurrection is? Rising from the dead, exactly. Spot on. The resurrection is talking about coming to life from being dead. Now, some of you were doing the Bear Grylls survival thing this afternoon. Put your hands up if you were doing that. Oh, quite a lot of you. So you may have an unfair advantage in this thing, but I'm going to just ask you a question about Bear Grylls and how radical and how wild you think he is. And if you think that his perfect evening is being sat at home in front of the fire, curled up with a mug of cocoa, I want you to crouch on the ground. And if you think he is so radical, so out there, so wild, I want you to stand up as tall as you can, and if you think he's kind of in the middle somewhere, just crouch or sit down. Go. Okay, well, all of the people that did the survival thing, he's way up here. Okay, brilliant, that's helpful, sit back down. So most of you think Bear Grylls is pretty radical, he's pretty out there, he's a pretty wild guy. I watched one of his survival programs and he drank his own urine out of a snake skin, which I'd say is pretty radical, that's pretty out there. And this is what Bear Grylls says about Jesus. He says, you knew I was getting to Jesus at some point. Jesus, the heart of the Christian faith, is the wildest, most radical guy you've ever come across. Jesus, the heart of the Christian faith, is the wildest, most radical guy you've ever come across. And that's coming from Bear Grylls, who most of us were standing with our hands up because he's that radical. And it's not just Jesus that's radical. This is the most radical claim. To say that he is the resurrection and the life, he is the person that goes from being dead to being alive, that is about as radical as it gets. And it's radical in that it is completely unique. No other religion, no other philosophy, no other outlook of life claims that anyone has risen from the dead in the way that Jesus has. This is completely unique in Christianity. And not only is it unique, it's absolutely fundamental to Christianity. If Jesus didn't rise from the dead, then there is no Christianity. If Jesus didn't really rise from the dead, then there is literally no point us being here this week. You might as well go home now. And tomorrow, I'm going to be looking at kind of the historical grounding for the resurrection. How can we know that it actually happened? And I'm going to be looking at some alternative options. So maybe Jesus didn't actually die in the first place. Maybe someone stole the body. But today I want to focus on if the resurrection did happen, which we as Christians believe that it did, what does that mean for our lives? Because if the resurrection did actually happen, then it changes everything. Our lives can never be the same. So, let's have a look at where this phrase, I am the resurrection and the life, comes from. Well, it comes from a story that we were looking at on the first night. Can anyone remember what the shortest verse in the Bible is? Jesus wept. Well done. You were all listening, that's good. And where it says that Jesus wept, this is where this story comes from. And if you remember, his best friend Lazarus has just died, and he is here talking to Lazarus' sister, and he says this: "Your brother will rise again. I am the resurrection and the life. Anyone who believes in me will live even after dying." So Jesus is taken to the grave of Lazarus, and as we've already seen, he weeps. He's absolutely devastated that his best friend has died. His reaction is exactly what ours would have been. He weeps. But what does he also do? Can everyone remember what that Greek word actually meant? He wasn't just sad, he was angry. He was angry, so that Greek word meaning snort like an angry horse. Jesus wasn't just upset, he was angry. He was raging that life shouldn't be like this. It's not fair that his friend died. And then Jesus prays to God and thanks him for hearing his prayer. And then he commands Lazarus to come out of the grave. And I want you to picture the scene. Lazarus has probably been in the grave 3 or 4 days. They're in the Middle East, so it's sweltering hot. It would have absolutely stank in there because his body would have started to decompose. And Jesus commands Lazarus to come out of the tomb, and this is what happens. The dead man came out, his hands and his feet bound in grave clothes and his face wrapped in a headcloth. Now, he probably would have looked a little bit like Jack and Carl as the zombies, to be honest, because he'd been all wrapped up in the grave clothes. But he would have been much more alive than those zombies. He'd have been walking out just full of life because he's just risen from the dead, thanks to Jesus. That is pretty radical. That's pretty radical. So that's Lazarus rising from the dead, but we're talking about Jesus rising from the dead. And I just want to have a look at that and what it means for us. So we've been talking over the last few days a little bit about what happened at the cross, about the fact that at the cross of Jesus we get to put all of our crap, everything we've done that we're ashamed of, all of our guilt on Jesus, and he changes it for his perfect life. I just want to give you one more example to illustrate that. Did anyone here get their GCSE results last week? Got them on Thursday, okay. And oh yeah, that's right, it was A-levels last week, wasn't it? And it's GCSEs next week, okay. So a few of you might be thinking of exams, and I pray that this doesn't happen to you, but let's imagine that on Thursday you get nothing but the most monumental fails. You failed in like the worst way possible. So it's not going to happen, it's not going to happen. Let's just imagine that's happening. You're all like, oh no. It's not going to happen. But anyway, let's imagine that does happen. You failed every single one of your exams, and on top of that, your report card for the year, like the kind of progress report that your teachers write, is just appalling. Every single teacher has written something awful about you. They said that you might as well not be at school anymore because you're utterly terrible. So that's what you've got here. And what Jesus has got is exam results that are just A stars across the board in whatever subject, like 20 subjects, A stars. And the report card for him is just perfect. Every single teacher is going on about how amazing he is. And what happens at the cross is you get to give all of your failed exam results and all of your bad report cards, you get to put that at the foot of the cross, and he gives you his perfect record. Now, I'm not saying that if you're a Christian you're going to get perfect exam results. This is a metaphor. I'm representing what's happening here. But at the cross, you get to put all of the mess that you've made of your life, you get to put it down in a place. You get to pick up his perfect life. It says this in the New Testament in 2 Corinthians chapter 5. Anyone who belongs to Jesus has become a new person. The old life is gone, a new life has begun. The old life is gone, a new life has begun. We saw that on the first day with my dad, who was a badass gangster who grew up in Moss Side and is now a vicar in the Church of England. Talk about old life, new life. We saw that yesterday with Will, not quite as dramatic, but he put aside all the stuff that was such a part of his old life and took on this new life. When you become a part of Jesus, you get rid of your old life and you take on a new life. And the thing about the cross is that wasn't the end of the story. It's interesting, isn't it, that we wear crosses around our necks and we don't wear an empty tomb, because that's only part of the story. I mean, I guess we wear an empty cross a lot of the time, showing that Jesus has risen from the dead, but the cross wasn't the end of the story. The radical claim of Christianity is that 3 days later, Jesus rose from the dead. And if the resurrection really happened, then that means that death isn't the end of the story. I don't know how many of you have watched films where something awful happens and you're like, oh my word, there's no way they're ever going to get out of this situation. I might as well just switch off now, this is awful. And then that terrible thing turns out to be like the most important thing and the thing that turns everything around. This is a really silly example, and I'm saying it because my goddaughter's favourite film is Frozen. But has everyone seen Frozen? Yeah, you all love it. You all love it. The ginger one is Anna, right? Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to give you an example from Frozen here. So the pretty little ginger one is about to die of her heart being frozen by her sister. Nice sisterly activity there. And she's like crawling like this, and she's about to die because the ice is like going through to every part of her body. And she sees that Hans, the good-looking but evil, always the way in Disney, prince, is about to murder her sister Elsa. And what she does is, even though she's not got any energy left in her body because she's frozen, she jumps in front of Elsa and saves her. And that is like the final straw for her, and that final little bit of effort means that her heart is now completely frozen and she's stuck like that. And you're like, oh my goodness, Disney has killed off one of their characters. This is awful. And my goddaughter's crying, I'm really crying, it's so dramatic. And then you remember it's Disney and it's all going to be okay. And Elsa hugs her and her tears melt here and she comes to life and it's all But that awful thing where she dies actually turns around the whole film, because when Anna sacrifices her life, then spring comes to the kingdom and hope is restored, and Elsa and Anna's relationship is restored, and everyone starts singing and it's all happy, and that's how the film ends. But it's not just true of films. This is what happens at the cross of Jesus in a way more profound way. Jesus on the cross said, "It is finished." And he wasn't just talking about his life being finished. He was talking about the victory being complete. What Jesus did at the cross meant that death no longer has its power. What Jesus is effectively saying is, guys, hold on, spring is coming. The resurrection makes sense of what happened at the cross. It shows us that not only do we get new life here on earth, like we saw with Will, like we saw with my dad, but actually we can look forward to a future where there will be no death. We talked a little bit on the first day about the fact that if life here on earth, the mess that we see the life in, isn't the way that God intended it to be, then it's certainly not how he's going to leave it. And we looked at that verse in the last book of the New Testament, in Revelation chapter 21, where it says, "There will one day be a day when there will be no more tears or sorrow or crying. All these things will be gone forever." And that is what the resurrection gives us hope for. So all of us who are suffering in this life can one day look forward to a future when all of that will be gone. There's a brilliant verse in the New Testament in 1 Corinthians 15, and the whole chapter is about resurrection. But this bit here is particularly talking about that future rising from the dead. And Paul says this, "Our bodies will be buried in brokenness, but they will be raised in glory. They're buried in weakness, but they'll be raised in strength." This is all brilliant if it's true, but how on earth do we know that the resurrection actually happened? Surely this is the craziest miracle ever. Surely this is like off the scale radical. And doesn't it go against science and evidence and things like that? Well, that's what we're going to be looking at tomorrow when I look at all the other options. But what I want to look at now is Jesus' life. There's a big magazine in America called Time magazine, and they recently wrote an article saying that Jesus Christ left the greatest historical footprint ever in all mankind. What they're basically saying, and it wasn't a Christian writing the article, what they're basically saying is no matter who you are, Jesus' life had an impact. Pretty much everyone has got an opinion about Jesus. My atheist friends have an opinion about Jesus. They think that he was, whatever he was, he certainly wasn't God, and they don't like him. Whereas Christians, on the other hand, they give up their entire life on the grounds that he was God, that he said he was God. So let's have a look at this Jesus character. Now, where do we get most of our information about Jesus from? Anyone? The Bible. The Bible is a good start. Does anyone know of any sources outside of the Bible where we get information about Jesus? Come on, theology geeks, there's enough of you. Yeah? Yeah, that's a good one. Technically, they're kind of linked to the Bible, but yeah. Very good. Who said Josephus? Like you. Good work. So there was a Jewish historian. Well done. Can we have a round of applause? Everyone, I'm just going to put it out, especially for your theology geek. And Joseph's nodding at the back there. So there was a Jewish historian called Josephus who wrote a lot about Jesus. There was also a few Roman historians. I'm not going to tell you their names because they're complicated, but there was a few Roman historians as well writing about Jesus. But you're right, most of what we know about Jesus comes from the New Testament. And if that's where most of our information about Jesus comes from, then we want to know that what we're reading is reliable, right? And the Bible is pretty old. No one pretends that it's not old. So how on earth do we know that the Bibles that we read today are exactly what would have been written hundreds of years ago? Anyone got any idea? Okay, I'll tell you this one. This is quite a geeky thing, so maybe we can learn this in next. Who just said textual criticism? That's exactly how we know about it, through a scientific process called textual criticism. And textual criticism is a geeky word for basically trying to figure out how old a document is, whether it's real or not, how you know it's real. And there's two important questions in textual criticism. One is, how long after the original event that it's talking about was it written down? And the second one is how many copies of that document do we have in existence. So let me give you a quick example. Let's imagine I went to a really cool party, Kanye West is throwing a party, Jay-Z's there, Beyonce's there, all the cool kids are there. I'm having an amazing time, and Hello Magazine asked me to write up what happened at this party. I meant to do it the next day, but I kind of forget. I forget again. 70 years later, I'm like, oh yeah, I never wrote up what happened at that party. So I'm 100 years old, right, because it's 70 years' time. And I'm on my deathbed writing about this party, because obviously that's the most important thing to do on your deathbed. And I write an account of what happens at this party. How reliable do you think that account is? Do you think I've remembered any of the important details? Do you think I know who Kanye West is at 100 years old? Probably not. That's a long time from the original event, 70 years later. Let's imagine I write it the next day. And that's probably quite reliable, right? I write it the next day, the events are fresh in my head, the people I spoke to, I remember, I don't know the conversations. So that's the first part of that, right? So that's, you can see that it makes sense that the closer it is to the event, the more reliable it is. The second part is how many copies you have in existence. So say I do write it up the next day, but it doesn't get into Hello Magazine, and maybe I post my account of the party on my Facebook wall. How many people do you think are going to read that? I'm not particularly popular. Maybe 10 of my friends might read that. They'll think, well, she's been to a party, Kanye West there, maybe that's the pull. 10 people read it, not particularly popular. If Kanye West wrote an account of his party and stuck it on his Twitter, where he's got thousands, if not millions of followers, how many people are going to read that? Quite a lot, right? It's probably copied quite a few times. There's lots of copies. Okay, so it's the same with these manuscripts. Have you got that? You can't see this at all, so you're just going to have to trust me. I've got some of these knocking around for the geeks among you, so I can show you. Yeah, you can't see it in any way. But what it is a table of some of the kind of most popular historical works that every single historian agrees is a factually correct document. And then at the bottom is the New Testament. So let's take, have you heard of Caesar? He was a Roman emperor. Everyone heard of Caesar? Right, so here, Caesar wrote something called not Caesar didn't write it, but during Caesar's time there was something called the Gallic War. And in this column here, it talks about the time-lapse. So this is the event that happened. This is when the earliest copy came into existence. And this is how many copies we have. And Caesar's Gallic War, it was written 950 years after the event that it's talking about. Pretty long time, right? How many copies are in existence? 9. So, and that is considered to be a really historical document. No one thinks that that's not true. Okay, so 950 years later, 9 copies in existence. We get to the New Testament. How long after was it written? Well, some were written as early as 30 years after the event, and actually there are parts of the New Testament that were written as early as 3 years after the event. And how many copies have we got in existence? Well, 5,000 Greek, 10,000 Latin, 9,300 others. In terms of looking at it from a historical perspective, looking through the eyes of textual criticism, the New Testament stands up massively. Okay, so there's the geeky part out of the way. So I think it's fair to assume, I mean, you can come and talk to me later, but I think it's fair to assume that the Bible is pretty historically accurate. Even non-Christian scholars would agree that. So what does the Bible say about Jesus? What does Jesus look like in the Gospels? Well, I think it's pretty obvious from the Gospels that Jesus believes himself to be divine. He talks about himself being God. He says that he has the power to forgive sins, which is something really that only God can do. And we've seen in these sayings, I am this, I am this. It's harking back to that verse in Exodus, which talks about God as the I am. Jesus is saying, I am. So I think it's pretty obvious that Jesus thinks he's God. And C.S. Lewis says that we have got 3 options. If Jesus is claiming to be God, then he was either bad, he was mad, or he was God. Right, I need 3 volunteers to demonstrate this point. You don't have to do anything, you just have to stand here. Excellent, let's go for the front row. We can have 2 gods, that's fine. Right, so there is can we have one more person that can make it the Trinity? There we go. To understand next to your Trinity friends. So I want you to be really bad, just give me your meanest face. Yeah, that's good. And I want you to just look a bit bit crazy. No one, you guys look really holy. Okay. Right, so listen up, because this is really important. C.S. Lewis says that when Jesus is claiming to be God, there are three options. Either he was bad, so Jesus knew that he wasn't God, and he was deliberately pretending to be God. Look at me, that's good. He's deliberately pretending to be God to fool all of you, right? He's not God, he's pretending to be God to fool all of you. Or he's mad. Jesus thinks he's God, wrongly, because he's not God. He thinks he's God because he's crazy, and he is telling everyone he's God because he's crazy. That's the second option. Or, he is my lovely Trinitarian God, and he actually is God. He actually is who he said he was. Okay, you can sit down. Thanks, gods. One God, obviously one God, three persons. And C.S. Lewis says this: you can shut him up as a fool, he's crazy. You can spit at him and kill him as a demon, bad. Or you can fall at his feet and call him Lord, God. But let us not come up with any patronising nonsense about him being a great human teacher. He hasn't left that open to us. He didn't intend to. What C.S. Lewis is saying is that you can't just call Jesus a good teacher, which loads of people do, because if someone is saying what Jesus is saying, he can't have been just a good human teacher, because part of his teaching is saying that he was God. So if he's saying that he was God, he must either be bad or mad or God. He can't just be a human teacher. The claim of Jesus to be God basically rests and falls on whether the resurrection actually happened. If Jesus really did rise from the dead, then actually that in itself is hard enough to believe. So that means that Jesus was God. If Jesus really did rise from the dead, then death doesn't have power over us. And our hope for life isn't just for this life, it's for the future. We're nearly finished. The resurrection, as we'll see tomorrow, like all history, can be investigated. We can look at it with kind of critical eyes and see, did this actually happen? And someone that did this for himself is a guy called Lee Strobel. And he was a staunch atheist, he was a lawyer, an investigative lawyer, and he set out to investigate the resurrection and write a book about why it wasn't true. And basically, as he kind of pulled together all the facts about the resurrection, he put it all together, and he basically became so overwhelmed by the evidence for the resurrection that he became a Christian and completely turned his life around, and the book ended up being completely opposite of what he intended it to be. And he wrote a book called The Case for Christ, which is all about actually how the resurrection did happen. So if you want to read more about that, that's a really fascinating book, The Case for Christ. And I think we have a tendency to assume that the wanting evidence and believing that kind of scientific proof is an important part of things is only something that we're interested in as modern people. And actually the only reason people believed that Jesus rose from the dead in his day was because they just blindly accepted those sorts of things. They didn't care about things like evidence back then. But I think that's a really patronising assumption. And it's also completely wrong. Going back to the Bible, evidence plays such a huge part in the Bible. If you look at John chapter 20, there's a disciple called Thomas, who incidentally is a twin, like me, like Kate. And Thomas wasn't there for some reason when the rest of the disciples saw Jesus, who'd come back from the dead. And this is what Thomas says to the other disciples: I won't believe that Jesus has risen from the dead unless I see the nail wounds in his hands, and unless I put my fingers into those wounds, and unless I place my hand into the wound in his side. Thomas's reaction is exactly what ours would have been, right? I've seen a body rise from the dead. Show me. He wants tangible evidence. And likewise, the third gospel, so Matthew, Mark, Luke. Luke was a doctor, so he'd have had scientific training, that would have been his background. And the opening lines of his gospel, he talks about the importance of the eyewitnesses, the people that have seen Jesus rise from the dead. And he says this: I've carefully investigated everything so that you can be certain of the truth. I've carefully investigated everything. He knows that the people that are reading his gospel won't be convinced unless he's gone through the evidence himself. Evidence played an important part in the Bible. The gospel writers were convinced that the resurrection actually happened. All of the early Christians were so convinced that Jesus rose from the dead that a lot of them died for their faith. And there are millions of Christians today who believe that the resurrection actually happened, that Jesus rose from the dead. Jesus said that he was the resurrection and the life. And that means that we get to swap our rubbish life for his perfect life. We get to put our failed grades, our awful report card, and we get to take on his A stars and his perfect report card. And it's not just for this life. We don't get new life just in this life. We get the hope of a future where there'll be no more pain, no more sorrow.